So it's been a little over 4 years since the announcement of the new Gungrave Gore. And here we are, and it's finally out. And I didn't think this game would be released after all of the delays and the rebuilds from the ground up. But as one of the biggest fans of the original games as well as the anime, I figured that I owed it to you guys to give you my first impressions of the game so far. And a little side note here, if I sound pretty rough throughout this, it is because I'm getting over being sick again, so my voice is not entirely there. I was going to do a stream of this on Friday in my Gungrave cosplay, but obviously I didn't sound good enough for it, and I would have been coughing the entire time. It would have just been a miserable experience for everybody involved. But man, if you had told me in 2022 that we would get sequels to some of my favorite games of all time, that I was the only person asking for those sequels, and two games that are going to do commercially very poor and probably poor with critics as well, but I love the heck out of them, between Soul Hackers 2 and the new Gungrave, I would never have believed you. But this still gives me hope for some of my other bucket list games that need to exist, that don't exist, that I'm the only one asking for. Very happy that the game is finally out. When you first boot up the game, you have the option to watch a recap of the story, which is pretty good considering that a lot of people who are just jumping in with this game are likely not veterans of the other two games. It's even possible that somebody playing this is someone who has seen the anime, but because the other two games are, well, I guess the other three games, since they're very rare and obscure now, and you're not likely to own a PlayStation VR, this may be the first game in the series you've had the opportunity to play, because it's not only on PlayStation 4 and 5, but it's also on Xbox and on PC. So there's a lot of different ways you can play it. The fact that they give you this recap is really cool. They actually digitize, like trace over some of the frames from the anime and use these sketches to put together this continuity of events where it goes into the backstory of the first game, recaps the events of the first game and the second game in very good detail, and establishes this continuity for the game series that is entirely separate from the anime while still using some visuals from the anime, which I thought was cool. The story of Gungrave VR is never mentioned in this recap, and I don't know if that's because VR is considered non-canon or if it's because the game came out much more recently than the other two Gungrave games, and they just figured that if there's any of the three other games that you are likely to have actually played going into this one, it's VR. The setting for this game, I thought, looks really cool. It's this pseudo cyberpunk dystopian future kind of thing. It has a very cyberpunk, very Deus Ex vibe to it, and I think that's pretty fitting. It seems like the natural evolution of what Naitao kind of concept out for the original game when presenting it to the other developers at Red Entertainment for the general concept for what the world would be like. And the world that he kind of envisioned for the first game was like this 1960s mafia movie kind of setting, but slightly futuristic, and give it like a Hong Kong action, Hong Kong noir kind of spin to it. And so I think that the look and the aesthetic of the world in this game does capture that, and the visuals are surprisingly very high fidelity. I was expecting this game to be a budget title that cuts a lot of corners, but the graphics and the cutscenes are surprisingly really good looking. I was concerned in the trailers that Mika is almost completely absent from a lot of the preview cinematics that we got, but as we get to the final version of the game, sure enough, we see her right away in the beginning. And they've aged her up once again, and she looks fantastic. I couldn't be happier with her inclusion there. I just wish that her English voice actor from Overdose was able to reprise her role, but I know it's been 17, 18 years since that game, so I understand. But aside from that, the cutscenes have only really been there to establish where you're going next. And for the first major arc of the story, again, I haven't finished the game yet, but the first major arc where you're playing as Grave, from the very beginning up until when you have to retreat back to your hideout and some more story things happen, there's almost no story or character development in any cutscenes. So about 10 missions go by where the cutscenes are just there to establish where you're going next, and some mainstream reviews have called that out and said, this game is very light on story, which is in the spirit of what the first Gungrave game was about, because Naitao made it explicitly clear that he was just trying to have a fun action game where it was fun to shoot people, and the story was kind of secondary to that. But I love how in Overdose, every single break between missions is a lot of long, indulgent cutscenes and a lot of banter between characters. And it just seemed like a much more of a complete package with better storytelling. And we lost a little bit of that going into this game so far. I was very surprised at the beginning that the game has a very robust tutorial, and it adds so many new mechanics from what we last saw in Overdose that you definitely need to slow down and pay attention to what the game is telling you. It definitely gives you this feeling like a traditional character action game, like your Platinum game or your DMC or something like that. And so paying attention to all the different mechanics that the game gives you access to is really important, and you'll be using all of them. And so it is one of those things where you get better as the game, the more you get better at the game, the more you play it, and the more you master all those different mechanics. The camera is pulled out and is pretty far away from the character, gives you a nice perspective over everything, unlike a lot of modern third-person games where the camera is sucked in super close to the character's back. When I thought about what a modern Gungrave would look like, that was my initial fear, is that the camera was going to be like a foot away from his back and you wouldn't be able to see anything. When you fire the Cerberus guns, they fire, one trigger pull will fire a burst of 4, which definitely helps mitigate hand fatigue, and you'll need to get used to that because at first you'll want to just spam the trigger repeatedly over and over again, and the game actually gives you a tooltip that says you don't need to do this, which I think is a good design decision because just for some reason your hand fatigues a lot more easily using your trigger finger and pulling the trigger all the way back than it was just using your thumb to mash square, which even that got tedious in Overdose and could easily fatigue your hand. So that was a good way to relieve tension on you, the player, and on the controller itself. More actions from fewer inputs, which I think was a good idea. Now, Naitao actually tweeted out and said he asked people if they thought they needed the full auto mode from Overdose, which I've never personally played with. Maybe I should try that. But it would be one of those things where if you would just hold down the trigger and continuously shoot, which I don't think is a bad idea, but I kind of like the manual feedback of pushing the trigger. But it's something that he asked people if they thought they would like to see in the game. I noticed that your melee attack feels very underpowered, especially compared to Overdose. In the original Gungrave game, your melee was just one single swing. You couldn't spam it. But it knocked down pretty much every regular enemy around you in a single hit. And the melee here in this game feels very underpowered and requires upgrades to make it better. The only melee attack that deflects rockets is the one where you're stationary. And in Overdose, you could just mash the melee button and swing your coffin around and around and around, and you would always deflect those rockets. And you had a lot more tight timing to do that, so it made sense. Your actual forward swinging melee attack, where you're walking, cannot deflect rockets, which that may have also been the case in Overdose. I'll have to play it again to double check. But it just feels kind of wrong in this game. Like they didn't decide to add that as a feature in there. And so a lot of times you will be close by other enemies and you'll instinctively go to block a rocket and you'll take a step forward and you'll end up just completely eating that rocket to the face. Although it does seem like they don't do as much damage to you as they did in Overdose as well, which is nice. There's no run button in this game like in the first game, and there doesn't really need to be. Your overall movement speed is faster than in the first game, but slower than it was in Overdose. And in the previous game, whether or not you did a dash or a jump was contextual based on whether or not you were walking when you hit the X button or not. And now there are two separate buttons, which I think is a little bit disorienting. And so I will instinctively be trying to do a dodge roll with the X button and end up just jumping, but it's something to get used to. The shoot dodge, the Max Payne, John Woo style shoot dodge, was one of the primary means of DPS in the first game and sometimes in Overdose. And I feel like it's barely useful at all here. You don't really get that many shots out from doing the shoot dodge like you used to. You'll get one or two bullets out, and that seems like all that happens, unless the timing for it is just very specific. I haven't had the shoot dodge work for me like it used to. I heard a lot of mainstream critics complain about the shielded enemies, saying they're too annoying, when I feel like the solution to them is really obvious. The charge shot is obviously the best way of dealing with them, way, way, way better than melee attacks are. And the charge shot is really cool, although I don't think it's as easy to use as it was in Overdose, and it's not like this 3-hit combo like in Overdose. It's just one single shot. But I thought that was kind of a nebulous complaint. Like, the critics were not really paying attention to the mechanics very well. Although I guess it is kind of annoying to have an enemy that has exactly one answer to it, and you just repeat that answer ad nauseum over and over again. They took a note from Doom 2016 where the executions give you part of your shields back, and that is something I would have killed for in Overdose. That is such a good idea, and it's one of those things where your health and your shields are very tight in these games. There's no really conventional way to gain your health back, aside from using a demolition shot in the previous games. And so the fact that continued aggression will actually reward you and give you additional safety in combat is, I think, a really good mechanic in a game like this, where it's like your answer to being damaged is not to retreat and wait for your health to recharge, it's to keep pushing and hope to get one of those executions that gives you some of your shield back. And I think that's just a great mechanic. And there was many times throughout this game already where I was very, very close to death and dodged it narrowly by getting one of those executions in and getting my health back, and it was made for some really, really tight combat. At first, I thought the game was using too many different terms for too many different moves, and I wasn't really paying attention between the difference in using your chain to grapple enemies and use them as a meat shield, or chasing them to get close to them. But using an enemy as a meat shield was great for avoiding damage, and chasing them ended up being good utility for getting close to groups of enemies, to use the triangle move, which I don't remember the name of, or to gain some distance away from a group of enemies towards a stray enemy. There was a specific encounter I could think of where there was a bunch of enemies behind me and one stray enemy off to the distance, and so I used the chain grapple thing to quote-unquote chase that guy, and it got me away from that group of enemies that was about to attack me and got me some safety, which is really cool. So far, the boss fights have been some of the best thing about this game. They are incredibly well designed. The boss fights are typically the highlight of a lot of the peak moments in the Gungrave series, and I feel like these definitely continue some of the better design sensibilities of the previous games. So as far as upgrading your character goes, I like that you can pick and choose your upgrades, and that there are a lot of them, but I almost preferred how they did it in Overdose, where they gave you an upgrade automatically after completing a certain stage, and it was the same fixed upgrade every time you played the game. I don't like how in games like DMC or Bayonetta, upgrade points are tied to your level completion performance, because it punishes suboptimal play for being a new player and makes your first run through the game harder than it should be, because you don't have all the tools that you would have on a later playthrough when you know how to play the game more optimally. So I think to intentionally restrict upgrade points behind performance is punishing new players and is giving you a bad first impression, because there's probably some abilities that I should have at this point in the game that I don't have the currency to afford, and I think that would be a problem I would not have in Overdose, where they just gave you the upgrades automatically. The sound design is really good overall. The shooting sound effect is something that it can't be annoying or it will ruin the game, because you'll hear it millions of times before the game ends. The ambient sounds and all of the sounds the enemies make when hurt are surprisingly good and varied as well. The soundtrack so far has been a little disappointing. There are some good heavy metal tracks that trigger in large encounters, but there's been no jazzy breakcore kind of music yet that is reminiscent of the previous games or the anime. And in the first major segment of the game, the first couple of chapters in the same location, there's this ambient track that plays constantly during regular encounters, and it just feels really off and out of place. But yeah, overall, I think that concludes my first impressions of Gungrave Gore. So far, I really love it. It is incredibly more faithful to the previous games than I was expecting it to be. I think it's been modernized in the correct ways and not overly modernized, and I was very impressed with how faithful it was to the old games. I'm definitely more curious as to how the story is going to pan out. I'm definitely curious to play as Quartz and Bunji Kugashira as well, and since they've never been playable before in the series, and I guess Yasuhiro Naito is finally getting his wish of... I mean, he clearly wanted 3 protagonists from the beginning in the original Gungrave, but they couldn't do that due to time constraints and budget constraints, and the scope of it was just too big. He had three protagonists in Overdose, but he specifically had character designs for somebody who was reminiscent of Uma Thurman and somebody who is reminiscent of Bruce Willis. And so I can't help but feel like that Quartz and Bungie kind of fulfill that role in this game, although Bungie is an established character all the way back from the first game, who just refuses to die for whatever reason. Like, the dude has died in every other game in the series and is somehow still around, and I guess he's been undead since Overdose because he hasn't aged a bit, and I don't know how much longer in the future this game is from Overdose, but it's got to be at least another 3 or 4 years. Yeah, where I'm at in the story right now, things are definitely starting to get interesting, and I'm definitely looking forward to playing as those other characters and finishing out the story. From what I've seen from YouTube videos already, there's already some long plays and complete Let's Plays and stuff like that are out there. The game is clocking in at around 7 hours for most of those people, which is almost 2 playthroughs of Overdose combined. Overdose was around 4 hours, and the original game was around only 90 minutes. So I'm glad that it's significantly longer than all of its predecessors. And I know that this game is not going to do well commercially. It's not going to do well with critics. And there's going to be a lot of, outraged merchants online that are going to be like, don't buy this game, don't waste your money, blah, 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 blah. And those are not the intended audience for this game anyway. And this game is for a niche. It's for the fans. And I am so happy to see those people enjoying it. There was a launch event in Japan, and Naito was there, and he was signing copies, and everybody was having just a great time. And that really made me feel special. And I'm just really glad that this game exists. So that is that. That was my first impressions of Gungrave Gore. And I'm definitely looking forward to finishing it and giving you guys a more in-depth video on it when I do the Yasuhiro Naito retrospective. So thank you guys so much for watching. I'll see you guys next time.